in college football history terms, the year 1905 stands out as being the first year the sport encounters an existential crisis. That crisis is caused because a huge number of people died or were seriously injured playing the game we love. The typical story that you hear about 1905 goes that United States President Teddy Roosevelt stepped in to save football. He used a soft voice or carrying a big stick and told the powers that be that the game would have to change or he would abolish it forever. Most stories about the year 1905 are that simple. Many people died, Teddy Roosevelt changed the game, and football and all of us who love it were happily ever after. The real truth is not that simple. Were there really that many deaths caused by football, or was this a chance for critics to eliminate the game they hated? Was the crisis overblown by muckraking media members wanting to stir the pot so they could sell more newspapers? Did Teddy Roosevelt really save football? I will examine those questions and get you answers in this video entitled Blood on the Gridiron, the True Story of the 1905 Death Harvest. The football crisis erupts publicly when on November 26, 1905, the Chicago Tribune publishes a newspaper article with the headline, Football Year's Death Harvest, stating that 19 players have been killed along with 137 seriously injured. Newspapers around the nation echo the death toll. The numbers vary, and many publish lists of the dead and the wounded. The Jersey City News headline states, Gridiron casualties, while the Sioux City Journal uses football's death roll. The Cincinnati Commercial Tribune in December 1905 had claimed that 25 players had died on the gridiron, along with an illustration entitled, The Grim Reaper Smiles on the Goalposts. Back to that November Chicago Tribune article entitled Death Harvest. Now, the term death harvest might seem outlandish to us now, or clickbaitish, something that a guy would use in a YouTube video to get you to watch it and maybe subscribe to his channel and like his videos. But in doing research, I found that the term death harvest was actually used quite a bit. It was a term that appeared to call attention to a problem, such as a potential pandemic or a murder. And at the end of the year, they would have the year's death harvest, which would list all of the names of people, prominent people, let's say in Chicago, who died that year. But the article, in this case, the football article states, most victims were young boys. Of those slaughtered to make a touchdown, 11 were high school players, and 10 of the killed were immature boys of 17 and under. 3 hardened, seasoned, and presumably physically fit college men were slain. The others were amateurs. Body blows producing internal injuries were responsible for 4 deaths. Concussion of the brain claimed 6 victims. Injuries to the spine resulted fatally in 3 cases. Blood poisoning carried off 2 gridiron warriors, and other injuries caused 4 deaths. The article included a breakdown of serious injuries that did not result in fatalities. There were many broken body parts, including collarbones, shoulders, legs, arms, and ribs. Head fractures resulted in 19 serious injuries and concussion of the brain, 3. So did football really cause this many deaths? Many of the newspapers reporting in 1905 kept a list of the names of the young men who died and 1 young woman. So let's take a look at the cause of death for some of these football players. One of the players is listed as James Bryant, of Florence, Colorado, who was, quote, struck in the stomach and died almost instantly, quote. Another is G.C. Ficken from New Orleans, who was kicked in the head and died without recovering consciousness. Howard Montgomery of Hampden Sydney College was paralyzed in the lower body and died as a result of his injuries. Now keep in mind, as an aside, the life expectancy as 1905 is 47.3 years old for men and 50.2 years old for women. So nowhere near today. Let's continue. John C. Dondero, 26 years old, at Jewett City, Connecticut, received injuries in scrimmage which resulted in cerebral hemorrhage. Carl Osborne, 18 years old, at Belmore, Indiana, was heavily tackled and fell unconscious and was dead when picked up, one rib being broken and driven through the heart. There was even the death of a young girl recorded. The first death on record of a feminine football player occurred during the season, the victim being Miss Bernadette Decker, 18 years old, daughter of a leading politician of Cumberland, Maryland. In a rough scrimmage among girls of her school, she received injuries that developed into acute peritonitis. And then there's the ones that are just kind of weird. The oddities. Horatio T. Knight, 18 years old, at Exeter, New Hampshire, received injuries in a game which brought on meningitis. Joseph Latimer, an assistant coach in Mukwonago, Wisconsin, accidentally drowned. James Squire, 16 years old, in Alton, Illinois, suffered injury which resulted in blood poisoning. And perhaps the weirdest of all of them, Leslie Wise, 14 years old, of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who, quote, fell in a scrimmage and a weed entered his nostril, penetrating the brain. How is it possible that a football player would die with meningitis? Keep in mind that doctors in 1905 had very little knowledge of what causes disease. The first antibiotic, penicillin, wouldn't be invented or discovered, really, until 1928, so that's still a ways away. It was very possible that if you cut your hand, you could die of infection. Many of these deaths were attributed to football because they had to be attributed to something. For some newspapers, it was an easy target. Well, it's really best to say back at that time, they really didn't know any better. And it was not uncommon for the newspaper to blame the players for their own deaths. In an article from the New York Tribune on December 4th, 1905, the columnist states, one of the deaths described in this arraignment of football as due to the game is that of a mill hand who went into a match right from work at the bench and without any but the slightest preparation. Another is that Maryland girl. Think of that, and football takes the blame. Really, it is quite too ridiculous for words. The mill hand is referring to Dondero, who I mentioned earlier, who at the age of 26 was considered too old to be playing football. And there was that Maryland girl who shouldn't be playing football at all because it's a man's game, as the author states later in the article. Another passage. Football is a man's game, the most strenuous sport that we know. It is fit only for players who are absolutely sound in wind and in limb, and who have arrived at physical maturity so far as growth is concerned. Even then, it is madness for anyone to play the game except after a proper period of training calculated to fit him for its rigors. And yet we have thousands of mere schoolboys and striplings, many of them not out of knickerbockers, all playing football. Suppose we put the same boys to work in a New England hayfield day after day under a July sun. How many of them, think you, escape sunstroke? And yet haymaking is not regarded as a proper subject for prohibitive legislation. And still a later passage states, H.K. Morgan, a sophomore in Cornell University from Pennsylvania, suffered a broken thigh in a football game played on the university athletic field yesterday afternoon. Morgan had never played football before the game in which he was playing quarterback, and yet football gets the blame for foolishness like this. I mean, it kind of sounds nasty, but the columnist is not entirely wrong. You consider how brutal the game of football was at that time. One better be prepared for before playing the game. There are up to 200 plays per game. There's no substitutions. People play on both sides, right? There's no platoon football, so you have to play offense and defense. Every play is a mass play, pretty much, where players run directly into the line in a mass. They fall in a mass, and then they get up and do the same thing over and over and over throughout the game. But mass play is one of the reasons why the fans are upset with football, because they want it to be more wide open. They want more off-tackle runs or outside runs into open space rather than watching masses of men run into each other over and over. The concept of the forward pass doesn't exist yet, except in the minds of a very few rules makers. The Death Harvest article went on to talk about the recently slain players, as in players that have been literally slain right before the article was published. And one of those slain players was Harold Moore, although the article mislabels his name as William Moore. And Moore was a halfback playing for Union College. On November 21st, Union College was playing against New York University when Moore was involved in a tackle and was struck in the head. When he failed to get up, the team doctor and a Union College alumnus put Moore in a car and took him to a hospital, and he died of cerebral hemorrhage a few hours later. And this is the death that sets off a series of events that imperiled the future of football. Chancellor Henry McCracken of New York University telegraphed Charles Eliot, the president of Harvard. Eliot was football's most famous critic, and Harvard was one of football's biggest name teams. McCracken wanted Eliot to get colleges together to reform the rules of football. Eliot refused, basically because he believed the game was beyond repair. Nevertheless, McCracken called a conference, and their first meeting involved 12 schools on December 9, 1905. And a later December meeting on 28th that involved 62 schools led to the formation of the Intercollegiate Athletic Association, a group that would later become the NCAA. In January 1906, they will draft new rules that will open up the game and reduce the brutality and violence that is responsible for the deaths and injuries. The newspaper articles around the nation had an effect, as several schools banned football. President Nicholas Murray Butler of Columbia abolished football around that time at Columbia, and they wouldn't play again until 1915. Northwestern, Duke, and Union dropped football along with many others in the Northeast. On the West Coast, two of the most influential powers at the time, Stanford and California, eliminated football and switched to playing rugby for a decade. And note that rugby isn't really any less violent than football, but it doesn't have the notoriety associated with it. So it might have occurred to you that we've made it all the way through this far, and I haven't even once mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. So how did Roosevelt get credit for saving football? Let's talk about that next. Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick. If you remember earlier that I made the statement that an article in the Chicago Tribune set off the public outcry against football, it wasn't just that article, but that article was a spark in the dry grass that caused a wildfire. The public had been primed for an eruption because of articles that had been published earlier in the year. Journalist Henry Beach Needham had published 2 articles in McClure's magazine in June and July of 1905 entitled The College Athlete, a passage in Needham's articles called Unnecessary Roughness, detailed a conversation between two Phillips Andover alumni, one of whom played football at Princeton and the other at Harvard. The Harvard man, an African American, was angry at his fellow Andover grad because a Dartmouth player, also an African American, had suffered a broken collarbone against Princeton. I have removed the names from the conversation because they're not as important as the conversation itself. But here's how it went. Harvard player, at Andover, you used to say that race or color does not count. It is the stuff in the man. Princeton player, I stand by that now. Harvard player, no, you don't, and Princeton doesn't believe it. And I'm afraid you have absorbed Princeton ideas. Princeton was known as having a lot of people from the South in their college. You put him out because he is a black man. The Princeton player replies, we didn't put him out because he is a black man. We're coached to pick out the most dangerous man on the opposing side and put him out in the first 5 minutes of the game. Now, aside from the applied racism in that exchange, the attempt was clear. Brutality was built into the sport. That exchange makes that point, and it does it very well. Football isn't about playing fair. It's not about sport. It's about purposely injuring the best player on the team, the other team, to gain an advantage. Now, Needham was known as a muckraker, a term for journalists at the time who were dead set on exposing corruption in established institutions such as big business, government, and apparently higher education. McClure's, the magazine, was known at the time as a muckraking magazine. Teddy Roosevelt himself came up with the term muckraker. Now, muckrakers included writers like Upton Sinclair, who wrote the book The Jungle that was published in 1905, which was a fictional account of the corruption of Chicago's meatpacking industry. The book led to the Meat Inspection Act and Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, so it wasn't exactly like these people weren't having influence. And I don't know if you've ever read The Jungle, but it's about the horrible treatment of the people who were working in the meatpacking industry, and people didn't really care about the treatment of the people, but they were concerned about their contaminated meat. 1905 was in the progressive era, an era in which reformers wanted to expand the regulatory power of the federal government to eliminate corruption, unfair business practices like monopolies, and to improve society. Also in 1905 was the Chicago Teamsters strike, which led to deadly and destructive riots. 21 people were killed and 416 injured. And this is the world in which college football was played at the time. So Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, was a friend of Henry Beach Needham and had met with him that summer. Roosevelt had read Needham's articles and agreed that the game needed to be reformed. And by the way, Needham's articles, entitled The College Athlete, also talked about tramp players, a subject I will cover in another video. So the most commonly related myth about Teddy Roosevelt saving the game of football was that he saw a photo of Swarthmore football player Bob Maxwell covered in blood because he had broken a nose in a game and continued playing against Penn. And the photo sent Roosevelt into action. He demanded the game be changed and used his bully pulpit to call the biggest powers in football to the White House so he could give them the what's for, and that the game had to be changed or abolished. And this story about Roosevelt came from the 1944 book Encyclopedia of Sports, written by Frank Menke. There's likely no photo of Maxwell that's mentioned in his book. Roosevelt never mentions the photo. And all of this makes for a good story because 2 days after the bloody Maxwell game, Roosevelt did meet with representatives from Harvard, Yale, and Princeton about football and its reform. The said meeting took place on October 9th, just after the beginning of the 1905 season, and the meeting was arranged several weeks before the bloody game. Roosevelt was heavily involved in the 1905 season, but the idea that he somehow saved football implies that he planned to abolish it completely, even though he had no authority to do so, or that it was ever in real danger. At least not from Roosevelt. He was a huge fan of football. He believed that football built character, and he also believed that the rough aspect of the game toughened young men for their lives ahead. He worried that the trend towards leisure and luxury in 1905 would take away from the hardiness of a nation that had just conquered the frontier. What Roosevelt objected to was not the physicality of the game, but the idea behind that exchange that took place earlier about taking the other team's best player out of the game. He hated brutality for brutality's sake, and in his meeting with the three biggest schools in football, he urged them to rid the game of excessive violence and set an example of fair play for the rest of the country. John J. Miller, in the book The Big Scrum, How Teddy Roosevelt Saved Football, tells us that Roosevelt opened the conversation with, "Football is on trial. Because I believe in the game, I want to do all I can to save it. And so I have called you all down here to see whether you won't all agree to abide by both the letter and the spirit of the rules, for that will help." And then he provided examples of what he considered crooked play by Harvard, Princeton, and Yale in previous seasons. He discussed the case of a team's coach urging his players to commit fouls when the referee could not see them. Roosevelt said that just as cheating at cards was disgraceful, so was cheating at football. Both deserved punishment. He insisted that players and coaches must conduct themselves honorably, rather than with an eye towards securing an unfair advantage. So both Miller, the writer of that book, and historian John Watterson tell us that Princeton and Yale disavow knowing anything about crooked play by their teams. And both of them, Miller and Watterson, also relate that Walter Camp, the father of American football, quote, made some considerable talk but was very slippery and did not allow himself to be pinned down on anything. The end result is that the representatives draft a statement by which they agree to be fair and play a good game of football, and then they leave. The implication here is that throughout history, Roosevelt threatens to end the game, but there's no indication he ever did that, other than the fact that he's Teddy Roosevelt, and his most famous saying is, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." The McCracken Conference. So what really happened? You remember earlier I mentioned Chancellor McCracken of New York University. I really want to say release the McCracken every time I hear his name.
Release the Kraken!
And how he had gotten 12 football playing organizations together for a conference. Well, at the conference, those 12 institutions held a vote to determine whether they would abolish the game of football completely or agree to retain it and reform the game. And they voted to reform the game. And this led to a later meeting at the end of December that involved 62, some say 68 schools that became the forerunner of the NCAA. Now, before that meeting occurred, the Intercollegiate Rules Committee, which was the established ruling power at the time, tried to put together its own set of reforms in order to remain in power and stave off McCracken's reformers. Representatives from Yale, Penn, Princeton, Cornell, Harvard, and the University of Chicago, their coach was Amos Alonzo Stagg, who'd made a name for himself, got together, but they could not agree on rules changes, largely because they each had their own interests in mind. Each wanted to preserve their own playing styles, particularly Harvard and Yale, who continuously tried to outflank each other politically. In the end, the old powers had lost their influence. The McCracken reformers would take control. They would establish their own rules committee, and in 1906, they would make a huge number of rules changes that would set football in a new, but not necessarily less violent course. Conclusion. At the beginning of this video, I proposed some questions. Were there really that many deaths caused by football, or was this a chance for critics to eliminate a game they hated? Was the crisis overblown by muckraking media members wanting to stir the pot to sell more newspapers? Who's ever heard of that, by the way? Well, there were a lot of deaths caused by football because it was a brutal game. It needed to be reformed. It needed change. Were the deaths overstated? Yes. The topic was clearly used by some newspapers for sensationalism, but at the same time, many of the deaths could be blamed on ignorance of medical knowledge at the time. The reason the crisis happened at the time it did and the way it did was because the death harvest type articles brought everyone to a boiling point. Fans hated the brutality and the mass play. Academic critics felt football had too much power and influence at their universities. Football factions themselves were tired of men like Walter Camp, the father of American football, controlling the rules. 1905 was everyone's chance to exert influence and take control of the game. And keep in mind, there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Did Teddy Roosevelt really save football? John B. Miller's book, The Big Scrum, talks about how Roosevelt was involved in the politics between Yale and Harvard. It's an excellent book, and I would recommend reading it if you're more interested in this subject. It's very well done. But a fair question is, if you took Roosevelt out of the picture completely, would it have made any difference? And I think the answer is no. The real difference centers around Chancellor Henry McCracken. Had McCracken successfully gotten Harvard President Charles Eliot involved, there's a good chance Harvard would have abolished football, and that would have had a huge effect across the nation. Eliot did not get involved, however, so McCracken continued with his own conference. And the result is that in 1906, new rules makers get together and pass huge reforms to the game. It's interesting to note that these reforms have little influence on the number of deaths caused by football, but that will be the subject of our next video. I am John Johnston, founder of Coronation. I hope you enjoy these history videos. Hope you subscribe to our channel. Please give me some feedback about anything you'd like to see or anything I could do different or better. Thank you for listening.